It was the summer after I graduated high school, so I hadn't started at Pace University yet, even though I'd only gone there, would only go there for 4 days. But it was summer 2019. I was kind of tired of city biking, and I didn't have a car because I knew that I was moving to the city, and I had totaled my GTI the previous year. I was like, you know what? I need some wheels. And there's an app now called Revel, which lets you rent electric mopeds on demand, kind of like city bikes now. But at the time, it didn't exist. So I said, I needed something cool, I needed something that wasn't electric, and I needed something that wasn't a bicycle. The obvious decision was buy a Honda Grom. I started looking for Honda Groms and realized that they don't make anything under 50 cc's, and in order to have something that you don't need a license plate for, it needs to be under 50 cc's in New York. And honestly, that may be a gray area law, and you probably still do need a license plate in order to do so, but they probably won't give you as hard of a time, and under my ownership, I never had a hard time. So what I ended up doing was buying a 49cc Grom clone in Darien, Connecticut, which is an affluent town about an hour outside of Manhattan. Went to go check out the bike. It ran great. It was a 49cc CVT with disc brakes. It couldn't have been easier to ride. I looked like a clown on that bike, but it was cool and it was loud and it got looks. I rode it to the train station, the Metro North train station, and tried to put it on the train because it was so small and just, get it into the city that way. And I got a few stops down, and a conductor, when trying to click my ticket, was like, "Is this yours?" And I was like, "Yes." And she was like, "Is it gas powered?" And I was like, "Yes." And she was like, "You are committing a felony." And I was like, "Oh, so I should probably get off this train because I'm not allowed to have combustible liquids on the Metro North Railroad." So I got off, and I had a friend in Old Greenwich who I knew had a pickup truck, and he was a busier kid. He's a lacrosse coach and what have you. But I gave him a call and I said, "Hey man, how does $250 sound? Let's smack this thing in the back of the pickup and drive me into the city." So he obliged and put it in the back of the pickup. It just took two of us to lift it on there, and we got it into the city. And I was living in Tribeca at the time. So I had that bike for about a week, and I put maybe 100 miles on it. I never had to fill the gas tank because I had it for such a short amount of time, and it's like a 2-gallon tank, but the bike gets 70 miles to the gallon or whatever. So I really had hardly owned this bike. But I street parked it, and how I protected it from thieves was it had drilled front brake rotors on it. So I would take 2 padlocks and put them through the front rotor holes so that if you tried to move the bike, the padlocks would get stuck on the caliper and the bike wasn't able to move. Now, what I didn't really realize is that you don't have to actually move the bike to steal it, or at least the wheels don't have to rotate in order for it to be stolen. So one morning I wake up, I was working at a small restaurant on Governor's Island at the time, and that was how I was, getting to the ferry and whatnot. And so I wake up and the bike's gone. Well, I'm not that surprised, but I'm definitely disappointed. And, it wasn't an expensive bike. It was $1,000, but that was pretty much all the money I had at that age. And so I was broke again, as usual. And I asked the building manager for some of the security footage because there's, I parked it right out front of the lobby of the apartment, even though there's no doorman. There's, kind of just 2 double French doors that you tap into. And so there's a camera that faces right down onto the street. And, obviously the bike was in the middle of the frame, and he obliged and let me watch some of the security footage. And of course, at 2 a.m., 2 guys in a, clapped out Chevy Silverado from 1999 come at just as the bike had gotten to the city. It left the city. 2 guys pick it up, put it in the back of the truck, and drive off. And that was that. So that bike, I guess, cost me over $100 a day during my ownership because I owned it for less than 7 days and I paid $1,000 for it. You win some, you lose some, and I'm sure next time I own a motorcycle, if that ever happens, I'll be a lot more careful. So I was coming back from a sailing trip, and during that trip, it just hit me. I am going to start in the automotive industry. And actually at this point, I was still very much involved in my startup, and it was before I had gone to work at collecting cars, before I had even done any consignment. So this was very early on. A family friend who ran the Saab kind of collection sale dealership warehouse in Gowanus, Brooklyn. My friend Mark, who runs Zurich Classic Motors, was pretty much the only person that I knew in the auto space that I felt comfortable approaching, essentially. And so I reached out to him and I said, hey, I'm a young kid. I know that you're probably swamped. You do a great job with your Instagram. Not sure what it is exactly that you do other than collect Saabs and, sell one once in a while. And he's had built a really gorgeous, warehouse space with all this Saab memorabilia, and it's just a really cool vibe. And I just wanted to see if I could be involved in some way, shape, or form. I reached out, said, can I help you with anything? And he said, yeah, I've got, a couple cars going to bring a trailer that I just want help organizing and doing that listing. And that was actually my first experience with online auctions, kind of just helping him sort photos and help answer, some of the questions and help with wording and whatnot. But in addition to that, he had always done a tent at the Lime Rock Park Historic Festival. And what was required of me was just to help him drive some Saabs up from New York up to Connecticut. So I agreed to do that, and, not realizing that all of these Saabs were 4-speed, 5-speed, 6-speed manuals. Sometimes in life, you just have to say yes and deal with the consequences later. So I went there the day before we were supposed to go up to Connecticut and shuttle these cars, and he asked me to run an errand, and the car that he asked me to run the errand in was his, I think, mid-90s, rusted out, falling apart Toyota Tercel. Now, the caveat here was this was a stick shift car, and we were in the middle of Brooklyn, and it was, 3 or 4 o'clock. So rush hour is just starting to hit, and that is a terrible, terrible place and time to learn how to drive a stick. Without telling him I didn't know how to drive stick, I went out, took the Tercel. I think I stalled it coming out of the parking spot, but, one stall is acceptable anymore, and it obviously becomes clear that you have no idea what you're doing. I managed to lug it out of the spot, and, I had driven dirt bikes and four-wheelers, which had, the hand clutch and the foot, gear selection, and I got it. I think I went to AutoZone to, pick up some Xerox, green coolant for him. So I got there and it was all fine, and I realized the parking brake didn't work, and I was parked on a hill, and I didn't even know what to do because I didn't even realize that you could leave the car in gear to instead of using the parking brakes. I think I chalked the wheel, actually, instead of just leaving it in gear, and, picked up the stuff, got back in the car and started to drive back. And, at this point, rush hour was in full effect. I just remember stalling at a 4-way intersection in the middle of the intersection right as the light went from yellow to red because it had taken me so long to just get the car moving forward. The resounding sound of angry New Yorkers and honking forever lives with me from that moment. But eventually I got the car back and all in one piece, and, little did he know that that was my first time driving a stick. So the next day rolls around and, we drive the Saabs from Brooklyn across Manhattan all the way up the West Side Highway and begin our journey to Connecticut. And so it was all well and good until we get to southern Connecticut and, you get into the Stamford, Greenwich, Westchester County area in New York, and that's usually where things tend to get backed up. And so it was just nonstop first to neutral to first to neutral. And for me, it was the most strenuous thing ever because I didn't want to mess up my first foray into the car business, even if it was something simple as just learning how to drive a stick and shuttling a car up to Connecticut. But we made it, and, I didn't grind any gears, I didn't stall, I don't think, and the car ran fine. We got there in one piece, but I just remember getting up from the seat at the end of the journey, and, we had, stopped for gas once, and the seat and, my pants and my shirt were just absolutely drenched, even though the car had air conditioning, just because the entire time I was, trembling okay, don't stall, don't stall, don't stall. Just remember, clutch in, shift it, gas, clutch out. It was all fine, but I think that entire experience took a few years off my life expectancy, and, I'm sure there's a tumor growing somewhere in my brain just by virtue of the level of stress that I experienced. But better man for it. Now most of my cars are stick, and I'll never go back. So I had grown up in and around Manhattan in New York City, and, even after moving out at the age of 11, I had always gravitated back towards it. And, the second I graduated high school, I was back in the city. But there are many things I love about the city, and there are many things that New York offers, and there are many interests that New York caters to. The car enthusiast hobby is not one of those interests. And actually, if you are an enthusiast thinking about moving to New York, don't. Or be ready, willing, and able to give up your passion. So I had never owned a car in New York, and, I would park in the municipal parking garage near my apartment for $75 a day, and I tried to avoid driving in as much as I physically could, unless there was a good reason to do so. That being said, while it is not a good place to own cars, it is a good place to buy cars, and I learned that firsthand when walking on Orchard Street in the Lower East Side, back from lunch with my girlfriend. We were going home to my apartment. We walked past this, elderly gentleman filling up his tire on his gray SLK 55 AMG, which is a car I've always loved. I actually rented one in Charleston, the same one that Doug DeMuro rented to do a video on. He did it on Turo. And so ever since I rented that car, I just always kind of wanted one. It reminded me of my Miata, except it had a 5.5 liter V8 in it, and it was automatic, which is nice for, city driving and whatnot. I didn't really think much of it. I just said, oh, that's a rare car. My girlfriend was like, why is it so cool? And I was like, this is why. It's a rare AMG, huge engine, little car, blah, blah, blah. She was like, oh, well, if you want it, just go make the guy an offer. What's the worst that can happen? And I'm a social person, and, I tend to be pretty gregarious, but sometimes I get in my own head, and approaching people at random kinda is not my forte. She helped me gussy up the confidence to do so, and I doubled back and approached the gentleman who was filling his tire and said, hey, want to sell me this car right here, right now? And the elderly gentleman, after, asking if I could buy the car off him and he would be willing to sell it, kind of gave me the spiel, and he was like, first off, yes, I would like to sell it, and here's why. I've got 7 cars, and I live in New Jersey, and I commute in every day. All of them are Mercedes. I've got a newer C43, and he had an S63, and a lot of really cool, some old, some new AMG stuff. Funny enough, I had 6 cars, so I was like, I'll take your 7th car, make it my 7th car, and it's a match made in heaven. And he thought that was very funny and obliged me there, so that was that. We didn't negotiate at all. He offered to sell it to me for 20 grand, which I immediately accepted, knowing that, that car with that mileage, it was the last model year of that body style for the AMG SLK 55. So it was about $10,000 under market value. So that was kind of just a no-brainer to me. And we immediately walked to the bank, and I got him a cashier's check, as I always have done. And that was kind of that. Just lent me his plates, and I drove it home to Connecticut. Took the train back into the city the next day, gave him his plates back, and that was a completed transaction. Honestly, if it hadn't been for my girlfriend giving me the confidence to approach this fine elderly gentleman, I wouldn't have had I wouldn't describe it as a dream car, but it was always a car that I had fancied so much after renting one, and just such a rare and strange period in AMG's model lineup. It's this tiny, tiny, tiny little car. I mean, I barely fit in it, and yet you have the engine from the E55, the S55, all of these great 5.5 liter AMG. I mean, the SLK is the one that doesn't have the supercharger, but you don't really need it. All the others with the 55 engine get the supercharger, but yeah, I've loved the car ever since. Unfortunately, after putting 500 miles on it, I realized that it needed a diff replacement, so that cut into my margin a decent amount, but that work was just completed, and it's ready to get driven, and driven hard, so I'll probably ship it down to Florida as my drop-top traffic cruiser.
If you're ready for your next adventure, you're gonna need the right car, and the best way to buy your next car is with the help of Premier Financial Services. The Simple Lease from Premier Financial is the most powerful tool in the world of exotic car financing. You get all the benefits of a traditional loan, like the ability to accumulate equity, pay it off at any time, and they give you a perfectly easy to understand amortization table, but you also get the benefits of a lease, the low payment, the flexible terms, the low down payments, but also you get to use some certain tax benefits that leases entitle you to. They've taken great care of me, and I know they'll take great care of you, so check them out now at the link in the description below.